transposition that we're not used to. And so you had to laboriously by hand copy out all those parts. But of course, getting the horn and getting the music is only a small part of the chore, because eventually you've got to get around to figuring out how in the world you're going to make these things work, because this is a far cry from trombone playing. Well, fortunately for me, Henry did not get sick for a while, and I had some time to work up a few things. But in the course of the next 4 or 5 years, there were several occasions where I had to play the tenor tuba part. And they were always emergency, highly charged situations. But I got through them. And when Henry left the orchestra, Mr. Ormandy was kind enough to take a chance with me, and he asked me to play the tenor tuba and the bass trumpet, the valve things, on a regular basis. Well, the first few years of that were pretty hair-raising, but I got through them, and I eventually learned to really love that responsibility. I found that whether it was Wagner or Strauss or Hershey K or whoever it might be, Mahler or whoever, if they're going to bother to write for an unusual instrument in a symphonic orchestra, they're going to make it pretty nice for you. And I think with no exceptions, it's well written for. They're very highly exposed parts, very soloistic. I got much more exposure playing the valved instruments than I ever would have gotten playing a trombone, only trombone in the orchestra. And I really enjoyed that. And as the years, my 18 years there went along, it became one of the major thrusts of my life. Now, that's my story. It started out with a real shocker, kind of like a sforzando to the back of the head or something, but it ended up very nice, and I really, really enjoyed that association. Now, we're going to hear a little bit from some of the other people, and they have some different ideas and some different thoughts. We will have to be very careful with time, but we have, in addition to the different areas that we're going to speak about, we have some different thoughts as to whether or not doubling is something we really want to do, whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. And we're going to start out with the positive. Larry Campbell is at LSU, teacher of low brass there, and graduated from the Eastman School of Music. He's principal euphonium for 4 years in the Coast Guard Band, and second and principal in San Antonio, played in the New Orleans and St. Louis orchestras, and now principal trombone in the Baton Rouge Symphony and the Baton Rouge Opera. I've heard Larry do some marvelous things on both euphonium and trombone, and he's written some articles about the aspects of doubling, and he's going to speak to you briefly and perform a little bit for you. Larry?
Thank you. Some of you that might have read the article that I wrote for the TUBA about a year ago, please bear with me, because basically this is the same article, so just hold tight. I'll do a little bit of playing and have the fun afterward. As a performer on both euphonium and trombone, I honestly believe that all trombone players should be able to perform adequately on euphonium, and all euphonium players should be able to perform on trombone. This means extra time, study, and practice, but in the long run, it's more than worth the effort. I'm sure there will be many who will disagree with this statement, but I'll attempt to convince all performers on these instruments that it is a valid premise. As an opening argument, I'll pose a question. How many times have you trombonists wished that you were more adept at the euphonium, and euphonium players vice versa? In both cases, the extra versatility and higher ability of a fine doubler would seem to be enough of a valid reason. But most trombonists would probably feel there's adequate work without the trouble and worry of learning the valves. On the other hand, many euphonium performers are out to prove they're going to make it, either by performing or teaching, without the benefit of a good slide technique. In both cases, the musician is limiting his performing abilities, job opportunities, and musical growth. Doubling offers a wide range of musical opportunities and can create more interest in both instruments by performers and composers. Having started on the baritone horn at an early age, I had the advantage of being able to develop my embouchure and pitch to a relatively high degree long before my arms were long enough to reach the lower positions on trombone. Since the F attachment can enable students to play the 6th and 7th positions, in 1st and 2nd, as you know, most players and musical directors feel this will be as good as learning on the valves. However, In reality, few students on trombone ever get started with an F attachment. Therefore, the pitch recognition, especially in the lower positions, will be learned sharp in most cases. The pitch will be developed poorly in the beginning, which is the most important aspect of the learning stages for a student. Even with an F attachment, it's still much more difficult to develop good pitch, as the slide positions will probably leave much to be desired in accuracy of tuning. Since the 7 valve combinations on euphonium correspond with the 7 trombone positions, the ear development will be much more accurate and will give the student a much better idea of where the actual pitch should be. This is not to say it's going to be perfect because of the discrepancy, like in 1 and 3, 1, 2, 3 naturally. Over the years, I've noticed a higher degree of pitch accuracy, though, by trombonists who started on baritone or euphonium or worked on the valves in conjunction with trombone. Just as the euphonium can help the trombone in pitch development, so can they both help each other in developing legato tonguing and slurring facility. This might seem to be a strange statement, since the euphonium player simply pushes valves and makes the slur perfectly every time, while the trombone player has to have the legato tonguing technique developed, which makes phrases sound as if they are being slurred. Now, is that right or wrong? I say wrong right now. How many times have you heard a player try to make a smooth slur only to have an unwarranted overtone partial slip into the phrase? How can the trombone help eliminate this? Simply by applying the legato tonguing technique from trombone to euphonium, a player can use the tongue to help get over extremely difficult intervals, which a performer may be having trouble slurring. For example, take an octave from middle C up to high C. Without the use of the legato tongue technique, the performer has a good chance of catching high G flat, A flat, or B flat. With the use of the tongue, the chances of making a correctly connected slur are increased. This will give more confidence to the performer when he hears a smoother, more accurate slur being played. This use of the legato tongue on euphonium is one of the greatest aids in contributing to a fine slurring technique and should be mastered completely. Just remember, the airstream never stops. Simply tongue lightly into it, keep it moving. You'll find many difficult slurring problems will be solved on the euphonium. On the other hand, by using natural slurs on the trombone, many rapid 16th note passages, trills, mordents, grace notes can be played which otherwise would be impossible. After all, natural slurs on trombone are the equivalent of changing your valve combinations, since the tongue is not used in moving from note to note. The knowledge of the overtone series is essential in learning to play natural slurs, as you have to always be moving to a different partial when changing slide positions. For example, a D above middle C produces a glissando when moving to middle C without the use of the tongue. This is because both notes are fifth harmonic partial in their respective positions. By moving to any other note than C, a player can produce a slur without tonguing which is comparable to pushing the valves on a euphonium. By using this natural slur technique, the trombonist can play rapid passages, many times as fast as the euphoniums. Pryor's Bluebells is a good example of the natural slur combined with a light, fast tonguing technique. When done correctly, the trombonist can keep the tempo moving as fast as any euphonium player. However, here is a problem unique to the trombone, since a thorough knowledge of alternate positions is vitally important in producing most of these natural slurs in the Bluebells. The use of the alternate positions is one of the biggest differences between the two. Very seldom does the euphonium player need to use alternate fingerings compared to the need of alternate positions on trombone. Remember that on trombone, the player needs to look for the easiest, shortest, and smoothest slide position. Therefore, what are termed alternate positions in reality become the best positions. Help. Don't think of a position as being an alternate or second choice position if it makes the passage easier. It's now the best position. There are two last minor problems involved when switching on the instruments. One is the holding of the instruments, the other is the mouthpiece. Many trombonists complain about breathing problems involved with the euphonium resting on the stomach. If a player pulls the horn into his stomach with his left hand, there will be a hindrance in the breathing. Simply think of pushing away from the body with the left hand instead of pulling into it, and keep any degree of tension out of the arms. This enables the player to take deep breaths without the horn hindering in any way. And I'll just interject here a little ad for Dee's stand. That's another great way too. his little stand to rest the horn on. It's no different, it's no different for the euphonium player switching to trombone, since there is nothing more awkward than the left-hand position on the instrument. It simply takes time and practice to get used to keeping tension out of the arms and body when performing on either instrument. The final problem should not even be a problem. The mouthpiece should be the same for both instruments or within 1 or 2 numbers. Bach 6.5 AL, 7, 8, 9 fine baritone mouthpieces double well with a small bore trombone. Many performers like these mouthpieces with a euphonium and large bore tenor trombone, but I personally feel they are too small for these larger instruments. A 3G, 4G, or 5G Bach or the equivalent in Schilke, Parentucci, or other good mouthpiece give excellent results in doubling between large bore trombones and the euphonium. The most important thing is to get a mouthpiece which is right for your playing and produces a true characteristic sound. There is a great difference between the two instruments. It's a mistake for the trombone player to attempt to make the euphonium sound like a trombone and vice versa. The performer should make certain to listen and to produce the correct sound for the instrument he's playing at that exact moment, for once the beautiful tone and technique of these instruments are mastered, the musician's performing ability on both will be improved and the enjoyment of doubling will be enhanced. It will be well worth the extra time, work, and effort. And the most important thing is sort of the fun of being able to just go from one and grab one, pick up the other, and just back and forth that way. And that's what I will attempt to do. If last night I'm getting too old for these 2 o'clock closings, like I'm getting out of practice on those. I'm going to have to get back in practice, which I'm doing quite a bit of this week, I see. The 2 o'clock closings over here at Mama Bear's or whatever it is. So, give you a little idea just from one that you're familiar with, namely bluebells, some parts of bluebells from one to the other.
Brian Bowman also needs very little introduction. Most people know Brian Bowman and his work. I think, Brian, I probably heard you first solo with a Michigan band at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. Did you do that tour?
So, in 1970 or so.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, that was before we knew each other, but I was very impressed then even. Brian did go to Michigan, got his bachelor's and master's in euphonium. Since then, he's been in the Navy Band, in the Armed Forces Bicentennial Band, and now is in the Air Force Band. Being in Washington, he got his doctorate at Catholic University, but that was in trombone. So Brian comes to us very well qualified to speak about both instruments and the connection between them. He is an author, having written very many articles and a text, and he has recorded a couple, at least 2 solo albums that I'm aware of. He's the past president and chairman of the board of the TUBA. And Brian has a little different view on the subject. So we'll hear now from Brian Bowman.
When I first started my studies in trombone, seriously, I found that I was studying at Catholic University with John Marcellus, who was then principal of the National Symphony. I actually had played trombone since 7th grade when I first was a member of a boys' chorus, and we needed someone to play trombone on Alexander's Ragtime Band. And I'd played trombone all through school, all through high school and college, played principal in the University of Michigan Orchestra and Dixieland groups, and done a lot of trombone playing. And I felt I was fairly accomplished as a trombone player until I did my entrance recital into Catholic University and found out as I was trying to play the elevated doctoral literature that I had run into some real roadblocks in the playing that I was doing. And while they were not extremely serious, I bought different equipment and studied very hard, went to Philadelphia and studied for a year and came back and then entered the program successfully. But in that experience, I found that there were many things and many problems that we face as doubling instruments on a serious level. If we're just going to play a casual affair, sometimes we don't have that problem. But there are 3 categories I'd like to speak quickly because we're short on time, where we really have to reorganize our thinking and our abilities when playing both euphonium or baritone horn and trombone. Those 3 areas are, first of all, the mental approach or the concept of playing, of the sound mainly. The second would be the physical adjustments we have to make with our own body to accommodate these things. The third area would be the equipment that we are using. Larry broached all 3 of these topics actually, briefly in his talk. In the mental approach, we're looking at a conical versus a cylindrical instrument. The euphonium is a highly resistant instrument because it has all those curves in it. You're blowing, it's very easy to blow. In fact, it's one of the easiest brass instruments to produce a sound on. It is, and it produces a fairly nice sound right away, whereas the trombone has only 2 bends. The minute you start blowing in that, most euphonium players, when they start playing trombone, run out of air very rapidly because they're not used to virtually no resistance for their air to blow against. They're just the 2 curves. And so we often, most of my students have a hard time when they switch back and forth without making some adjustment of their air column and some idea of their sound, of what kind of sound they want to produce. The concept of tone quality on euphonium is a much broader, more floating sound than on trombone. On trombone you need more concentration, more feeling of projection of the sound. But on euphonium you don't want to have a euphonium that has a real point to it. But on trombone many times you need to have that feeling even though the end result is not that way often. The purpose of playing is often a very important concept. Are you playing in solo work? Are you doing concert band or brass band or German band or jazz work or orchestral work? But by developing the concept, then we can make the physical adjustments to match that concept. Physical adjustments that I found to be the most common to make, first of all, were the breath, the air column idea. On euphonium, I have to think of a solid stream of air all the time, but no idea of concentrating that air into a smaller stream. I try to think of a broader string, sort of as the air going dom, instead of dee to the center. Think of dom, sort of letting the resonance and the resistance of the horn help the resonation of the sound. If I concentrate the air into the center too much, the tone comes out like a donut, or maybe half of a donut. And the sound dee gets very narrow because you're concentrating the air so much with your embouchure in your throat or other physical attributes that the sound comes out very much constricted. On my euphonium students and my colleagues in the bands, I can usually tell when they've been playing a lot of trombone and not much euphonium, because they'll come in, their euphonium playing has a narrowness to the tone quality. It doesn't have the richness in the blend many times that they've worked on, because they're fighting against the resistance of the horn. Vice versa, when I have euphonium players who are working on trombone, they'll come in with this big, soggy, non-projected tone, ho, 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 on trombone, especially in the low register. So we have to sort of work on is their ability to create and change the resistance. Also articulation. Euphonium is such an easy instrument to blow that many times they're very sloppy with their articulation, especially legato articulation, as Larry discussed. Multiple tonguing is quite different according to the resistance. It's something that has to be adjusted. The clarity of the tonguing. The sound on the euphonium, the low range, is so easy to produce, you just drop everything and let everything hang out many times. This is not ideal, but they can get away with it on euphonium, and so they do it. So when you put them on trombone, you can correct some of those problems by learning to make those adjustments. Range is often a problem. Because of the conical bore of the euphonium, some of the pedal notes are very easy to produce. Very easy to produce, and the upper range sometimes is a little more difficult. However, I found, just in casual talking with trombonists, that they find that the upper range on the euphonium is much easier for them many times than on trombone. And they just pick it up because of the resistance change. And many euphonium players feel the upper range on the trombone is a lot easier than on euphonium. So there has to be some adjustment made in range. The posture or the physical holding of the instrument has already been discussed, but it's something that is a real problem. Many times with the euphonium, can I borrow your horn a second? Sure. When we just sit down with the euphonium, they'll plop it down their lap. And you see where the mouthpiece comes. So what do? Whump right down to it, and it crunches everything up inside. But most players don't hold the horn up with either a stand or a pillow or their muscles of their left arm, and they have a problem with playing and getting a good sound, a good breath. Thank you. So posture can be a big problem. Intonation. I can imagine the first time a trombonist picks up a euphonium, unless they have one that's tuned in the factory perfectly, like mine, they find out what we have to go through with instruments that are not as adjustable as the trombone. Learning how to center and recenter tones and find alternate fingerings and other adjustments. Same thing when the euphonium player goes to the trombone. He finds that his fourth position is in 10 different places because he has to place it for every note to match the partials that he's been used to favoring. So these are just physical adjustments that have to be made. As far as equipment, depends on your purpose once again. A lot of people have problems switching mouthpieces, especially switching rims. I personally have found that I can't use as deep a mouthpiece on trombone as I do euphonium. It doesn't work for me. I want to sound like a trombone player when I play trombone, not like a euphonium player. So I use a shallower mouthpiece on trombone than I do on euphonium, but I use exactly the same rim. I use a Schuke 51D, which is a very deep mouthpiece on euphonium, but I've gone to a straight 51 model on trombone, but I have the 51D contoured onto that. There can be a lot of experimentation with mouthpieces to find what is exactly right for you. Also, different makes of horns vary so much that I try to find an instrument that is more matched to the type of resistance that I'm used to. So that would be a point of experimentation. The biggest disadvantage of doubling many times can be the amount of time taken to do it. If you're going to play both instruments well, you have to practice them equally. You have to spend enough time with them. You can get by doing less, of course, but it depends on the level of accomplishment you wish to accomplish. I don't play my trombone as much now as when I was doing BMA work on trombone, but I play it every time they pay me. It comes out of the case. And that's the same way with John Marcellus at Eastman House. He says every time they pay him to play Euphonium out, it comes with a case. And so it is a very valuable thing, but the disadvantages are something that we have to deal with. There are problems in doubling that we should deal with, and they're not incomprehensible, but they can be dealt with, and I hope that this is at least awakening some ideas to some things that we could be working on. And I'll turn the time, because we have very little left, to the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
When we had a little more time, we had spoken about perhaps passing that idea around a little bit. Maybe if you want to speak to that as we go along, but we are running a little behind. Just a very quick little story that I think is kind of interesting before we get into the Cleveland Orchestra concept of doubling. Bob Lambert was the first trombone of the Chicago Orchestra several years ago, and now he lives in the mountains of Colorado on a large ranch there in a cabin, way away from all sorts of communication and civilization. The last tour I took with the Philadelphia Orchestra, we played in Denver, and Bob knew Bob Harper and Paul Kraswicki very well, and so he got in his pickup truck and he drove 2 or 3 hours, however long it took, to get down to Denver to catch our concert. And afterwards we went out, the four of us, to a restaurant, and we were talking, and there was a little lull in the conversation, and Bob said, "Dee," he said, "I've got to tell you a story." He said, "Nobody else will probably appreciate it, but I think you will." He said, "In this cabin up in the mountains where I live, I can only get one radio station, and it's kind of a rockabilly station, and every morning he turns it on to catch the weather and the news and so forth, and has a cup of coffee." He said one morning he had it on, and a song ended, and the DJ came on, and he said, "Folks, we're going to have us a little culture today." He said, "We're going to play a piece by recorded by the Chicago Symphony with Fritz Reiner, called Pictures in an Exhibition." And Bob said, "My God, that's me. I made that record. I played that Beadlow solo." So he rushed over the radio, and he cranked up the volume, and he poured himself another cup of coffee, and he settled back in his chair. And sure enough, music started, and there's Herseth playing the Promenade, and then in come Kleinhammer and Jacobs, and Bob's he said, "These are all my friends. They're playing for me this morning. You know, this is great." And they play the first Promenade, and then the second movement, and Farkas comes in on the Promenade, and Bob said, "You know, Dee," he said, "I wanted to reach down and just test the valves, just to kind of see if they were still there." He said, "I know you know what I mean," and I do, because, you know, the horn's laying down there, you know you've got this big solo coming up. And he said they played another movement, and he said pretty soon, he said, my heart started to go like this. He said it was just like I was going to play this thing. He said pretty soon the sweat started to pop out, and I could feel the adrenaline surging. They got through the saxophone solo, and he said it was almost time, and he could hardly wait. And they got to the movement right before the Beadlow, and they finished that movement, and by that time Bob's way up in the front of his chair, you know, could hardly wait to hear himself. And there was a click on the radio, and the guy said, "Well, folks, that's enough culture for one day." So now we're going to hear a little culture from the Cleveland end of things. Al Kofsky attended the Cleveland Institute of Music, is a member of the Cleveland Orchestra since '61. Prior to that, he was principal trombone in Kansas City. He's been the instructor of euphonium and trombone at Baldwin Wallace for 24 years. And he played euphonium on the Cleveland Symphonic Winds recording conducted by Frederick Fennell. That was one of the first digital recordings, right? That's right. That's a great recording, yeah. So this is Al Kofsky.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dee. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to speak to you people and be with this distinguished panel. I've been, as Dee said, been a member of the Cleveland Orchestra since 1961, and I came in the orchestra as the assistant first and the low valve player, hired by George Zell, and stayed in that position for a few years until the second trombonist retired, and then I asked to play second trombone, and I wanted to have a little more playing time on trombone, and was able to do that, and I have done the valve work ever since. It's like, as Dee had talked about before, it's sort of nice especially being the second trombonist, where you sort of are in the middle of the section most of the time and don't get too many solos outside of maybe Rimsky-Korsakov, who must have had a brother-in-law or a cousin who was a second trombone player, because he always seemed to stick a little trombone solo in for the second trombone. Getting a chance to express yourself musically and interpretation. You get a chance as a valve player to play Biedlow from pictures at an exhibition, all the Strauss things that have tenor tuba parts, Mahler on bass trumpet. You have Strauss, a couple things with Strauss, and a lot of things with Wagner. So it's sort of a fulfilling position, even though it's sporadic. It's a lot of fun, but there's a problem. What are the problems of doubling in a symphony orchestra? Being prepared like a Boy Scout. You may look at a prospectus for the season. We get a prospectus for a whole year, as Dee well knows. The association puts out a prospectus sometime way before the season's going to start, maybe in April or maybe in March of the current season for next September. And you look through it, you want to see right away, wow, I wonder if I have to play anything with the valves. And of course you see nothing. Oh, well, it's going to be an easy season. I'm just going to stick on trombone. And then all of a sudden, you're 16 weeks into the season, and there's a conductor that got sick, and a change in program, maybe 2 days notice or 3 days notice, and there you are. Here I hadn't prepared, and all of a sudden, boom, I'm going to play something. So it can be problematic. So you have to find time because you want to stay on top of your trombone playing. If you're primarily a trombonist, like I think I am, and then you have to play the doubling instruments and be really on top of that, because you have, on bass trumpet, you have all the transpositions that the trumpets have. And if you don't keep transposing and the parts are written treble clef, either B flat, C, D, E natural, E flat, you may have a problem if you're not staying with that. The euphonium parts, which are tenor tuba parts, and the Strauss parts come up with a B flat bass clef transposition. Now, if you've never seen one or had to try and read one quickly, if you like to read alto clef down an octave, have a ball. So if you don't transpose your parts, like I have some parts here, I transposed them as years ago. I have most of my parts I have fixed up. Some of them I don't, but I have to woodshed. So there are problems there. Equipment, mutes. Bass trumpet isn't much of a problem with mutes because you can usually find some sort of an old type French style tenor trombone mute that's small enough, and you can, or some old wooden mutes maybe that work fairly well on the bass trumpet. But euphonium seems to be a problem. Finding a mute, there are the mutes available, but one that works, oh boy, especially if you have to play low. So I have a mute with me here, and I'm going to play, if I have time, if time permits, I'll play one spot maybe from Don Quixote that starts out, the very first entrance you have is on a mute, starting fairly low and going up, and I'll show you. I also have a couple of little rings that I made myself. Experimenting with mute, you may find that changing the cork placement will help a lot. Again, it may not. It depends on the volume of the mute and also the size of the bell, the bore of the bell, and how far that mute goes down. By changing the cork placement on the mute, let me get the mute. If you maybe change, if the corks are shorter and you start them lower down, so you have them not starting here but starting here, it may work. You have to take them and tape them on, take them off and tape them on. I have added about 1/8 of an inch of cork to the cork that was on this mute. I had this mute made years ago by Frank DePolis in Philadelphia, who was a horn player around Philadelphia many years. And I then still wasn't satisfied with the mute. I had some rings cut out with a saw, and then I had, starting with, I think this is a 1/2 inch. I had graduations made by 1/8 of an inch, and you can probably see the difference in the holes if I can get my fingers right. You can see the different holes, and I have here one that's in between these two here, and it seems to work for me fine. So I think if you would experiment and change the opening at the top of the mute with you can make them out of cardboard if you want to at first. Start with 1 inch or 1.5 inches and keep getting smaller down to maybe a 1/2 inch. I think you may find some pretty good luck. I think most of the other points were pretty well covered, and due to time shortage, I think I'd like to play a couple of things.
Well, I'll just stop.
Okay, fine. Okay. Since I spoke about mute, I'd like to play, well, first I think I'd like to play the Mahler 7th on this. This is sort of a large sounding, it's marked in German mid-grosser tone, which means large tone. I'd like to play this and give you my idea of what I think it should sound like as far as I played it with various conductors, and I think I have a fairly good understanding of it. So let me attempt this. This part, by the way, is very solo. It's only in the first movement that the tenor is called. It calls for a tenor horn, actually, not a tenor tuba. What the tenor horn is, I'm not sure. But this is the closest thing, I guess, that anybody knows that is really or supposed to be used. And it's really soloistic all throughout the first movement, and then you're finished. You don't play another note in the whole symphony, which goes on for about another hour. So it's a long wait after you play it. A lot of you have never seen one. This is the monster. Talk about intonation problems. It could be wonderful, something pretty bad. Okay, I'll play a little bit of Wagner. something from the Waltz Pure.
Very much, Al. Sorry to rush along, but we are really running behind. Jim Self, many of us know from the Los Angeles freelance musician. He plays for all the major Hollywood studios, made hundreds of motion pictures, probably best known as the voice of the mothership in John Williams' score of Close Encounters. That was this man here. Last November, he was voted the Most Valuable Player Award for tuba by the National Association of Recording Arts and Sciences, and last summer released his first album, Children at Play, on Discovery Records. It was chosen by the High Fidelity magazine as one of the top 10 jazz albums in 1983. He's a past president of TUBA, and he has an active doubling career, performing regularly on bass trombone, contrabass trombone, two-bone, string and electric basses, and electric tuba. And he has something I think he's going to demonstrate for us today called the electronic valve instrument that he's really enjoying right now. Jim Self.
Thank you. The first thing I want to say is the only thing I really take credit for is that I am a tuba player. Everything else is what we call here a double. In Los Angeles, the freelance musicians, which is most of the musicians, have to double practically. I'd have to think very hard to find any musicians that don't double on some instrument. It might not be another brass instrument, but the woodwind players, almost all of them, play many woodwind instruments. The percussionists, of course, do also. And virtually all the trombone players that I know coming up today, except for just a few of the older gentlemen, they all double on euphonium, and most of them double on bass trombone also. It's a requirement practically, and the requirement is the money. In film work, in television and motion pictures, a double pays 50%. If the scale is $150 for 3 hours, that's $75. It's a lot of money for maybe playing one note. And believe me, that's one reason why the tenor trombone players never use triggers, because they're losing the double in a sense. Of course, there's other reasons, for sound and other things too. But even people like this wonderful jazz trombone player that was on the stage here today, Bill Waters, I've seen him on dates on bass trombone. And now to get over to the tuba side, I grew up as a guitar player, and then gradually I was a bad guitar player, so I became a bass player, which a lot of bad guitar players become bass players. And all through my 20s and 30s, there was rarely a Saturday night that I didn't play some dance job somewhere as on bass. I gradually became involved in the electric bass because it's about the only way to compete with the loud drummers and everything else. And I had a long experience playing rock and roll and jazz, and I became more and more influenced by jazz, and I am intensely influenced by it now. And I play a lot of jazz as a bass player. Less on string bass these days because I have a back problem and it's a physical instrument. A lot of electric bass though. And that experience to me is probably the most important thing for me as a studio tuba player, and it's the rhythmic aspect. And my mind thinks like a bass player. And I know that I get compliments a lot from the rhythm section people that I work with, that I can feel good with them. I can make not necessarily just a Dixieland tune, but something I might play with the bass player in unison or something. And that's very important for a studio player, by the way. I'm doing my own clinic on Friday morning, and I'll get into all that stuff a lot more then. Just for what it's worth, he mentions a number of instruments that I doubled on. Besides the tuba, I have recorded on Fender bass, on Tubone, which is a valve bass, contrabass trombone, electric tuba, string bass, tenor tuba, euphonium, sousaphone, contrabass trombone, electric guitar, ukulele, and bass kazoo. Some of them very poorly. When I first went to Los Angeles, I was a bass player and a tuba player, and I didn't play any bass trombone. When I was about 20, I tried to play bass trombone, and I couldn't handle it. My ears weren't ready, or my whatever. My teacher in Washington, Lloyd Geisler, tried to get me into it. But when I got to Los Angeles, I found out that things had really changed. Years ago, the studio scene was all string bass and tuba doublers. Usually they were better bass players than they were tuba players. That gradually changed. A man who's here at the symposium or at the conference, Don Walter, when he came to town, he was a good bass trombone player and a good tuba player. So he and Tommy Johnson were very much responsible for getting that changed around. So the standard double for tuba now in the studios is bass trombone. It's almost a requirement. By the way, there's only one full-time tuba player in Los Angeles, and that's Roger Bobo. He's the only man that makes a living. By the way, he's the only man that has a steady paycheck, too. But he's the only one that really makes a living just playing the tuba. He does some other instruments, but he makes a living playing the tuba. Tommy Johnson and I probably, and Don Walter, probably 75% of our television work is doubling tuba and bass trombone. That's a 50% thing. My first job on bass trombone was with George Roberts playing second trombone. And I figured once I got by that job, I could do it. So I've been doing a lot of it. I don't think I'm a good bass trombone player, but I handle the most important things, which are rhythm and intonation. And the other people that I work with are great trombone players, like Bill Watrous and Dick Nash and Lloyd Elliott, and wonderful people. And I wouldn't be called back if it wasn't okay. Now, I could go on, but I'm not going to do it. There's a lot of things. I have a clinic, and I'm going to be playing jazz Thursday night at the club, and I'm going to play this instrument just briefly for you here. It's called the EVI. Another man was here yesterday, Mr. Shepard, and I gave a demonstration on it. I'm more into a commercial aspect of it, but it's a new instrument that is state-of-the-art. It's very important for everybody to be at least become aware of this thing, because the whole world is being taken over by electronics and computerization. And this instrument, the reason I got involved with it is because it's the first time I've come across a synthesized instrument that is expressive. And just briefly, I'll say I have a little thing I send out to composers I work for, and this is my brief explanation of it. The EVI is a very expressive wind-generated synthesizer capable of beautiful sounds, other instrument sounds, and many electronic synthesizer sounds. Because it is wind-blown, the expressive qualities of pitch, dynamics, vibrato, and timbre are all controlled in performance, as they are on acoustic wind instruments and with the human voice. Its range is more than 8 octaves, bass lines to piccolo lines. I have my EVI interface to an SMS 400 voice synthesizer, which greatly expands the sound capabilities with oscillation, modulation, filters, delay, etc., etc. I don't have all that stuff here. I'll have it at my clinic. And I'm going to give you a brief demonstration of this, and I'll be done. 2 minutes.
I'm in a very awkward situation here because I have to leave. I've got a TV thing coming up, but I'm going to introduce Ashley, and then Ashley, I think if you can go for about 10 minutes and wrap it up, okay?
I'll get more than I know.
Ashley Alexander, there's one man here, at least, that we've heard double on one instrument, as Ashley does with a double-belled euphonium, right? On the tuba jazz, and that's very impressive. According to his credits here, he's plays trombone, double trombone, and euphonium, and I hear a little trumpet and a little bit of some other things too, perhaps. He's the director of jazz studies and director of bands at Mount St. Antonio College in Walnut, California. Teaches at Saskatchewan School of the Arts in Canada. Member of the Tuba Jazz Consort, of course, and he's been an artist at all of the National Association of Jazz Educators conventions. Just finished last fall a 4-month tour of Western Europe. Has many, many records, some 40 albums, I see it listed here. And I think we all know Ashley's playing, and it's a pleasure to have Ashley Alexander here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As Jim can attest to, when you're going to do anything electronic, you always once in a while have to bite the bullet. Well, there was a late rehearsal in here, and we didn't get to do a sound check. And I want to demonstrate an instrument to you that has been around for a few years, but has been very mistreated and misaligned, and an awful lot of people tried it and didn't really know maybe how to use it or what it was. And the instrument evolved for a very simple reason. As Jim mentioned a minute ago, there aren't an awful lot of euphonium jobs in Los Angeles. And there are really quite a few trombone jobs that a lot of guys could qualify for. And you can't take a euphonium to a jazz band and sit down on third trombone. They'll just run you off. Yet, if you take a valve trombone in, you're in trouble again, because it doesn't look like a trombone, it can't finesse like a trombone. So there was a very ingenious young man, Larry Ramirez, about 10 years ago, came up with an idea, and he gave me a call, and I double both slide in valve. And I got very involved with the developing of this horn. And it has some real advantages, it has some real disadvantages. It's not the magic horn, but it's really great for doubling. A lot of you guys will be in college programs, some of you guys, and I'm not speaking to the pros, I'm talking to guys now that are still working your way through. And it's really necessary that you get a hold of some jazz background, because just time and time again, you have to play this. Now, you want to do traditional or whatever the particular work you want to work in, But where I come from, until you can specialize, you have to make a living long enough to not end up selling shoes or driving a truck. To stay in the business, you have to be able to pick up enough work to stay alive. And I feel that this particular instrument can be adapted to a lot of guys that are scuffling around, that are wanting to get their foot in the door a little bit and to play in a few more organizations. You can find yourself in trouble trying to get in a city band or something. There's 1 or 2 euphonium chairs, but there's always several trombone chairs, and it gives you a little more versatility. While we're talking about the playing of both instruments, I double all the time, and it is really necessary, as Brian brought up, that you play both embouchures. I play trumpet a lot, and when I'm really staying in shape and working both trumpet and trombone, I end up playing a gig on trombone and then carrying a trumpet mouthpiece and driving all the way home to get my trumpet chops balanced out, because one embouchure will tear up the other, I feel, if you don't keep them both strong. I've doubled different size mouthpieces a lot, which is kind of unusual. My father was a band director, and it seems as every time he ran out of something in the band, he brought it home, and I had to play it to get him through spring contests. And at the time, I thought it was terrible. But I got my first really good paying job on tenor sax and clarinet. And I couldn't believe that, because I wanted to play trombone, but the trombone chairs were tied up. One guy, his brother ran the band. The other guy, his brother was playing the chair. The 2 brothers were on the trombone section, so there was no way to get in the band. So I came on tenor and clarinet and then moved back as soon as one of them retired. But doubling is an advantage, but it's also poses an awful lot of problems. But it helps the guys to make more work while they're still trying to get things going. I've got a tape queued up, but I have to have a monitor, and we didn't get time to set it. Now, the easiest way to show this horn is just play for a minute, and then I'll show you a little bit about how it works. My wife is down there somewhere, and she's got some books. I don't know how many there are, but Mitch, if you want to send some of those across. It's a small book like this. I brought a few of them. There's some more of them downstairs. Just found them out wherever it's handy. I didn't know how to get these out. But spin that tape for a minute, and if it doesn't work, I'll just cut you off and I'll play something without the tape. This is the background I was going to use. The spring can really hang you up the most. Oh, is it going to be down here? Oh, great. This is the first cut on the second side of about 2 albums back. very short on time, so I won't play any longer, but the horn basically is a trombone. If you don't use any valves, it goes right through. A little bit of restriction, but it's oversized right through the center. And as long as you play just the slides, it's just a tenor trombone. Now if you want to play it on the other side, it's totally chromatic. Half step, whole step, step and a half. Now that's not what it's really good at. What really works great is as you're trying to switch over, you're a baritone player, euphonium player, tuba player. You teach the student to play only the second positions. Teach him only A natural and E natural, and they're on the slide. Everything else is in his fingers. Now there's some other tricks that I've gotten into this. There's a book here, and there's some more up and downstairs at the whole thing. But I discovered through the use of a doctor that Mother Nature has a built-in thing in our bodies. If one foot starts to step on the other foot, you can draw it back quicker. If one limb starts to hit the other limb, the reaction is quicker. Well, most of you are right-handed. Well, you think your left hand won't work. Well, I discovered a real simple way to do this, and it works great for French horns, and this is something that I was going to write an article about, and I'm giving it away here. But anyway, if you will take an Arby's book and play a measure, 2 measures, a scale at a time, and put the left hand on the valves, and put the right hand right over the top of it, and then generate the scale with the right hand. And every time you go to move with this hand can move just as quick as this one can when this one starts towards it. And you can become a left-hand valve player in just a matter of months. Now your fingers won't be as strong because you've been hammering down those valves, and you've got strength built in your forearms, but the action is there. Your left hand will move just as fast as your right one, providing that you get your hands closer together. So what I do is I have them do one measure, ba ba da 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 da, with this hand, and then keep it right above it and generate it. And the farther away your hand gets, the slower this hand will become. So you have to keep your hands together. And it was just an accident. A doctor told me about this, and I don't know anything about this type of neurology, type of nerve situation, but it really, really works. So changing over to the left hand is not a problem. Then you just take an exercise. Let's see. Pretty soon, when you get started playing long enough, when you're playing your trombone, the sound will flow into both hands. It will flow into your slide arm, it will flow into your valves. And you know it in both hands. Now as a trombone player, we all know when you see something, you can't reach it. You know there's no way you can get from 2 to 5, like on the bridge to Oleo or some of these things that we play. There isn't any way you can reach it. So what you do is use it as coupling, and here's where it pays off. Every position can be played in every finger. And here's where the horn really pays the way. Let me play some low C's. I missed them. That's a little better. Every note can be played in every position. Well, I'm going. I'm going. So you put the position wherever you want it. You certainly can solve it backwards. If you can't reach fifth, play it fourth. Let me show you. Let's say you got a B flat, a G flat, a F. Well, if you're a good trombone player, you might be able to get it in 6. But you're still out. Where are you going to go? You got to come in. At least eventually you're going to have to come in. Well, if you're in 5th here, you could have reached that note by playing it in 4th and put a half step on this side. Or you could have went 1, 3 and put 2 half steps over here. Think of it as 1 half step, 2 half steps, 3 half steps. I'll show you. Watch the note move. You just put the note where you want it, so you can reach what you can't reach. And as you begin to play the horn, and as it begins to flow into both hands, then you can make these decisions. Now, if you want to be a straight-ahead slide trombone player, like the great player that you're going to see tonight, Bill, it's just it's a lifetime skill to do this. But with the use of this silly contraption, you can sound about twice as good on slide as you really are. To play, if you play on the valves, it sounds valve. But as long as you move the slide one position, it will record lyric. as if you move 5 positions, cross positions, anything you want to do, as long as you move 1 position. Well, you know, boy, if you could play 1 position trombone on a recording day, you got it made, because you don't have any 2-5-2s or 1-3-4 or whatever you have to jerk for. Now, it has some other advantages, particularly in teaching crossovers. I started that a while ago. You teach a guy to play everything on the valves. He's a new euphonium player. First day you give him the horn, you can put him in a jazz band. You can go buy one of these silly things and go into a jazz band the next day and play if you got your bass clef chops prepared. You can read bass clef. What you do is you play it on the valves. The band director feels comfortable because it's got a slide. The rest of the guys in the band will talk to you because it has a slide. After you start cutting them a little bit, then they quit talking to you. But I've used this horn in numerous times. Well, the last job I played, I did the Harryana second suite on second trombone. And in the second movement, all those F sharps and all this stuff, and the lead trombone player poo-pooed me for 30 minutes before the concert. I was just subbing for a guy. Are you going to play that on the concert? I said, yeah. He really gave me a hard time. We got through the Harryana suite. He started wanting to know if I could get one for his own use. Now, it does not replace slide trombone, but it makes you a more proficient player. You can do more things without actually having to really do the hard part of learning the slide. Slide's a lifetime thing to learn. It's just like any other instrument there's just so much there that you got to do that you hardly can ever get it. Now, I'm basically a trombone player. My master's in performance and my PhD work was in performance on trombone. And it's just a lot to learn, but I've always been a valve player. It will transpose for you, but this is not an advantage. All you valve guys, watch these scales. Are you ready? That's a lot easier. It'll do exactly the same thing the other way. Now, it's not electric, and it won't go 8 octaves. Touché. But you carry your own amplifier. You are what you are, and it's not the end-all instrument. It's another way to try to make a living, and we got to be practical about this. It's easier to become a state senator than it is to get a euphonium position in a major symphony. Now, there are a few more trombone positions. And in jazz, you can count the number of big bands that worked last night on your hands and your toes in the entire United States. Now, if you're going to break into this, you're going to have to make a living long enough to get a chance to play. And the only advantage that and where I really use the horn for guys are converting Euphy and tuba players over to give them a chance at the work. And you can learn the glissando the first week while you play only the A naturals. Then pretty soon you play the A flats and the E flats. And by the time you've got put a new note in each week, by the time you've had the horn about a month, you can hold your spot pretty well. Because when the slide guys are really pitching around, you go back to the valves and you can get it in there pretty clean. And the band director won't care. It looks like a trombone. The leaders will leave you alone. But if you come in with a bass trumpet, you've had it right there. Now, there's a guy that's done this a lot in L.A., and he doesn't play it right. Bob took some lessons and stuff. We never could convert him over. Bob even Olsen plays one of these. And you see him on all kinds of shows and stuff, but now he plays it crossover. You can do it this way. But the horn is miserably out of tune, as all valve instruments are, compared to the slide intonation that you can get. So everything that you play goes through your fingers. It's all through your hand. So you compensate every note you play. And also, it teaches you to play centered, because you hear centered. On a Euphy, you're always pulling. My chops get so tired when I do the tuba jazz, because I'm used to playing centered tuba, and I'm biting that Euphy up and down all the time, trying to play it in tune. And you get to where you play the centered, you get that nice, pretty round trombone sound. It's not the answer to everything, but it might keep you eating one. Appreciate you.